Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everybody. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. I really apologize for the delay. I had to take care of some stuff with the city here locally that took a long time. So I apologize for that, and kind of took me off my schedule. But nevertheless, inshallah, we only have about maybe 12 minutes that we can use today before some of our other programs at 6 p.m. But nevertheless, we'll continue reading, inshallah, from the text. So where we finished off last session on Tuesday was Imam Khazri gave us a great summary of the 6 points that we all need to have in order to have a good prayer. And if you want to review those, inshallah, you can go back and just quickly kind of skim through or listen to the previous classes, inshallah. Now, he continues and he mentions and he says that he explains how you arrive at these 6 different characteristics. And then he says that these are the ways in which you attain these 6 different ingredients, these 6 different elements, or these 6 different stations. He says these are the ways in which you attain them. He says anytime that you try to attain one of them, the way that you do that is to try to think of the means. So if a person is struggling with focus in prayer, or if a person is struggling with having hope in Allah, don't think so much about the goal, think of the means, right? So he didn't just tell us what goals we should have for prayer. He said, how can you accomplish these goals? He gave us those means. So this is why it's really important for you, if you haven't listened to the previous 2 or 3 classes, go and listen to them, because it's not just those 6 elements, he also explains how to get them. So he says, never forget how to get them. And he says, because knowledge of the means is knowledge of the remedy. That you're trying to seek the remedy in your prayer, but you don't know how to attain it. You have to have knowledge of the means as well. Okay, so this is kind of how he introduces it. And then he mentions that famous narration of Aisha, where Aisha radiallahu anha, he mentions that the heart that reveres Allah is a heart that is so focused on Allah that when the time for prayer comes in, nothing else can distract that person. Nothing else takes away from that person's ability to focus. And he says that Aisha radiallahu anha, she said that we used to have conversation and talk with the Prophet ﷺ frequently, and then when it was time to pray, it was as if we didn't know each other. Like we were the most loving of spouses. He was with his friends, but then when it came time for salah, it was as if he didn't know them and we didn't know him, because we were just that focused on our prayers. So we were so focused on our salah that you couldn't tell that we were married, right? That you couldn't tell that we had that closeness. And then he mentions some really cool narrations. He mentions that it was once narrated to Musa alayhi salam that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala spoke to him. And when Allah spoke and revealed to him, he said to him that, "O Musa, that when you call upon me, when you invoke me, then make sure that you invoke me with limbs that are trembling." Trembling meaning, not necessarily trembling from fear, but that are engaged, like almost like you're shook, right? Make sure that you invoke me with trembling limbs and a reverent heart, and be focused on my invocation. Then he says, when you invoke me, make sure, this is a beautiful line. He says, when you invoke me, make sure that your tongue, that your heart is behind it too. He says, make sure that your tongue is translating what is in your heart. Don't just say things with your tongue that's not present in your heart, right? So he says, when you call upon me, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling Prophet Musa, when you call upon me, the words that you're using, make sure you do some reflection and make sure that whatever you're saying is also included in the heart as well, right? Don't just let the tongue go. And stand before me as a servant in need. That if you stand before Allah not realizing that you need him, then you're not going to have any success in prayer. So stand before me as a servant in need, and converse with me with a heart that is fearful and a tongue that is truthful. Then there's another narration that he says that Musa alayhi salam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala spoke to him, and he told, this is beautiful. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told Musa alayhi salam that what? Tell the big sinners, tell those sinners from your nation, the ones that are like big sinners, right? Not like the minor sinners, the big sinners. Tell the sinners from your nation that tell them that if they don't invoke me, right? That tell them to invoke me, basically. He says that if they invoke me, tell them to invoke me, and then I will remember them. That if they remember me, I will remember them. Even the sinners, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling Musa alayhi salam, tell them to remember me. If they remember me, I will remember them. But then he adds a condition to this. And he says that if they remember me without reflecting on remembering me, if they remember me without reflecting on it, like they're just sort of going through the motions, he says then I will remember them with a curse. So what's the condition here? It's actually a little bit confusing, but if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. That he's telling Musa alayhi salam, he's telling Musa to tell his nation that even a person who is sinful, that this person needs to remember Allah as much as possible. The only condition Allah is putting on remembering Him and worshiping Him, the only condition is that you actually mean it. That's it. That a person is sincere. He says that the minute that a person's heart loses sincerity in remembering Allah, then that remembrance, it goes from being a remembrance that is full of meaning now to being a remembrance that is what? Just ritual, just going through the motions. And in fact, it does nothing but push this person further away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so he says, Musa alayhi salam, or I'm sorry, Imam Khazri says that when Allah said this to Musa, that tell the sinners of your nation to remember me. And so long as they remember me, I will remember them. But if they remember me without actually thinking about me, if they're just sort of saying it off their tongue, right? Then what? Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that I will not remember them in a good way. I'll remember them with a curse. So then Imam Khazri says, if this is talking about the person who is a sinner, that is not remembering God when they are actually remembering them, that is not focused on them, that is negligent and distracted. That's a really good way of putting it. The one who is distracted when they're remembering Allah. You know, practically, you know what this sounds like? This sounds like when a person does something wrong and they say, oh, astaghfirullah, astaghfirullah, astaghfirullah. Like they don't actually mean astaghfirullah, right? Astaghfirullah, I'm seeking the forgiveness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I'm seeking His forgiveness, right? But when a person actually genuinely wants Allah's forgiveness, how do they say astaghfirullah versus when a person doesn't care? What are the differences? Like ask yourself, you don't even need to give the answers. What are the differences when a person genuinely seeks Allah's forgiveness versus when they don't care? How do they utter that? How do they utter that phrase? Right? The one who cares might actually stop what they're doing. The one who cares might actually like pause. And they might say to themselves like, man, astaghfirullah, like, may Allah forgive me. And they might actually almost like catch themselves, right? And so he says that when the person is a sinner, it's not their sin that changes whether or not Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will remember them. It's whether or not they actually genuinely care about Allah as they are invoking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay? And then he said, it is to this degree that these kinds of states are in the hearts. And he says people are divided. People are in different divisions. There are people who pray without a single remembrance of Allah during their prayer. And there are people who pray who their minds cannot be detached from Allah during their prayer. So you have almost two sides of the spectrum, right? You have people who they don't think about Allah once during their prayer. And then you have people who literally their mind never wanders. They're always focused. And then everybody, falls in between, right? So it's like a spectrum, okay? So he said that people are divided in this way. And he said that there might be some people who never think of God, and there might be some people who think of God so much, like the famous story that he mentioned of Muslim bin Yasar, that the masjid started to fall down. One corner of the masjid started to fall down, and he didn't even notice, right? And he didn't even notice. And he said there might be people who pray in a congregation and they couldn't even tell you who was praying on their right or who was praying on their left. They wouldn't be able to remember because they were so focused in their prayer. Okay? And then he says, and he goes, none of this should sound impossible. This is amazing. He said, none of this should sound impossible. That a person can pray and a building can fall down? What? How is that possible? That a person can pray and not know the person next to them? How is that possible? People say, oh, this is very, very, don't tell these stories, brother. These stories are too outlandish. They're too crazy. That's not true, right? So Imam Khazri says, don't doubt these stories. He says, don't for a minute doubt these stories. Why? Because he says, we see this kind of focus in the worldly issues every single day of our life. He said, there are people who, when they stand in front of kings, and they stand in front of leadership, presidents, they stand in front of celebrities, he goes, they are so overwhelmed and taken aback by the presence of who they're standing in front of. He said that when they leave the gathering, if someone were to ask them and say, hey, what were they wearing? What color shoes were they wearing? Or if a person were to ask them, hey, how many people were in the gathering besides you two? No one, he says that the person would not remember. So a person gets to meet the head of state, the president, maybe not our current president, but they get to meet one of the leaders of the world. And as soon as they leave that gathering, somebody says, hey, how many people were in that room? And the person, I don't know. I can't tell you. Well, you were just in that room for 30 minutes. You can't tell me how many people were there? No, I don't know. Why? Because I was so overwhelmed by the presence of that person. Right? I was so overwhelmed. So he said that this person can be so overwhelmed by the presence of the leader that they couldn't even tell you what clothing that person was wearing. They couldn't even tell you the color of the clothes that king or that queen was wearing. Okay? And he said that so for each person, there are levels of this. And we all witness it in our lives, whether it's sports or celebrities or whoever our focus is in. He said for each person, there are levels. And for each person, there will be a portion that is commensurate with how much focus and fear and awe and hope and humility we have towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He says Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala looks at your heart, not only the motions of your body. The motions of prayer matter, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala looks at your heart as well. And he said this is a statement of the companions. One of the companions, radiallahu anhum, he said that people will be gathered on the day of judgment according to the form that their prayer took. They will be gathered on the day of judgment according to the form that their prayer took. If they found it to be tranquil and serene, and it was something that gave them happiness and bliss, then the Sahaba used to say that based on how much joy they found in their prayer, that's going to be their position on the day of judgment. You know, like Southwest Airlines, the A group, the B group, the C group, or when you're flying a plane, first class, right? Business, economy, group A, group B, group C. The more joy you found in your prayer and tranquility you find in your prayer, on the day of judgment, you will be called with priority, just as you're called in this life with priority. Based on what? The joy and tranquility and peace you find in your prayer. We're going to end here now, inshallah, because we have another program coming up at 6 p.m. or not 6 p.m., 7 p.m. So I'm going to end here now, inshallah. And we also have the Qalam Hangout tonight at 7 p.m. as well. So I'm going to give everyone some time to kind of chew on the 15 minutes of mashallah, deep stuff that Imam Al-Ghazali gave us here. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us enjoyment in our prayer, and so that we will be resurrected on the day of judgment in a really good state, in the priority pole position based on the love of salah that we had in our hearts. Ameen ya Rabbil Alameen. Barakallahu feekum, everybody. Jazakumullah khairan. And I'll see you for continuing the study of this book next Tuesday, inshallah. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.